Harold Jenkins had always believed that paper remembered better than people. People are fragile things. They forget. They misremember. They let their emotions tint the edges of old conversations until the truth becomes something soft, distorted, and entirely unreliable. But paper is stubborn. It holds the strike of a typewriter's ribbon, the iron-gall acidity of 19th century ink, the precise, unyielding geometry of a surveyor's map. Paper does not lie to comfort itself. At 64, with his shoulders permanently rounded from decades of careful leaning over documents, Harold found more peace in the quiet aisles of the Seattle Public Library's historical records section than anywhere else in the world. The building itself was a massive, glassy monolith, but down in the basement archives, the modern world vanished. Here, the air was climate-controlled to a crisp, unvarying 60 degrees, meant to preserve the brittle fibers of the past. The relentless gray rain of the Pacific Northwest slammed against the high windows upstairs, but it never reached the microfilm readers. It never touched the steel vaults where property deeds from the 1890s still smelled faintly of old dust, vinegar, and time. It had been 14 months since Eleanor died. 14 months since the last time someone waited for him at home with a cup of hot chamomile tea and a gentle, laughing scolding about leaving his reading glasses on the nightstand. The old craftsman house in Ballard still carried her voice. It lived in the specific, predictable creak of the third stair, the slight stick of the kitchen drawer, the faded floral print of the armchair by the window. But lately, the silence in that house had grown heavier than any grief he could name. It was a dense, physical thing that settled in the corners of the rooms, waiting for him the moment he turned the key in the lock. Volunteering at the library 5 days a week gave him a purpose. And purpose, at least, kept the emptiness from swallowing him whole. Every morning Harold arrived at 9 sharp. He hung his damp wool coat on the exact same brass hook in the staff room, adjusted his tweed vest, and nodded to the younger, college-aged staff members. They called him Mr. Harold, with that gentle, soft-spoken affection usually reserved for beloved grandfathers. They didn't understand the archives like he did. To them, it was data entry. To Harold, it was a sacred vigil. He spent his hours scanning, indexing, and occasionally using archival tape to repair brittle deeds from the city's earliest days, back when Seattle was little more than muddy timber camps, saloon smoke, and desperate ambition. These papers proved that people had actually lived here. They had loved here. They had built families, lost fortunes, and fought tooth and nail for every square inch of land and legacy. He never could have imagined that someone was using a keyboard to wipe those lives out of existence. It began on a damp Tuesday in late October. The sky outside was the color of wet slate, and the library was mostly empty, save for a few students and the usual patrons seeking shelter from the cold. Harold was working on a digitization project, cross-referencing physical microfilm canisters from the mid-1990s with the new high-resolution digital cloud database the library had recently implemented. To anyone else, the work would have been mind-numbing. But Harold noticed the anomalies instantly. He was looking at a plot of land on 23rd Avenue in the Central District. On the physical microfilm, a photographic negative that could not be easily altered without a razor blade in a darkroom, the deed recorded that the property belonged to a family named Thompson, purchased in 1994. But when Harold pulled up the corresponding digital file on his modern flat-screen monitor, the name was different. The digital scan, perfectly clean and official-looking, stated the property had been sold in 1998 to an entity called Horizon Holdings, LLC. Harold blinked. He took off his reading glasses, wiped them thoroughly with his handkerchief, and put them back on. He looked back and forth. From the glowing green light of the microfilm reader to the bright white glare of the computer monitor. The dates were slightly shifted, the transaction numbers matched, but the names did not. Strange, Harold muttered to himself, his voice a low rustle in the quiet room. He moved to the next file in the sequence. A historic home on Cherry Street. Microfilm recorded a family ownership dating back 50 years. The digital archive recorded a foreclosure and a subsequent sale to the same anonymous corporate entity. Third file. Fourth file. The discrepancies were microscopic. A single letter altered in a surname, a date moved by 3 months, a digital signature that looked just a bit too crisp to be genuine. It was a ghost in the machine, a quiet digital rewrite of Seattle's history. If you believe that true stories like Harold's, stories of ordinary people standing up against the erosion of truth, deserve to be told, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It ensures these forgotten histories stay alive, because what Harold uncovered next would pull him out of the safety of the archives and plunge him straight into a deadly corporate conspiracy. Mike Harlan noticed the old man's frown before he even saw the computer screen. Mike was 51 years old, built like a retired linebacker who had spent too many years trading bar fights for steering wheels. He had a heavy, broken nose, a jawline covered in rough gray stubble, and eyes that always seemed to be scanning the exits of whatever room he occupied. 23 years with the Seattle Police Department, most of it spent working grueling shifts in the robbery division, followed by a long, exhausting stint in cold cases, had ended on a rain-slicked alleyway in 2014. A .38 caliber bullet had clipped his left lung, leaving him with a permanent shallow wheeze when the weather turned cold and a modest department pension that couldn't quite cover the rising mortgage rates after his divorce. Now, Mike drove a battered Ford Transit van for a local courier service. He delivered everything from high-end corporate legal packets in downtown skyscrapers to late-night sushi orders in the tech-wealthy neighborhoods of South Lake Union. The job paid poorly, and it did nothing for his pride, but it kept him moving, and movement. Movement was the only thing that kept the ghosts of his past quiet. The library was Mike's sanctuary during his lunch breaks. 3 or 4 times a week, he would park his delivery van in the alley, buy a cheap, bitter cup of black coffee from the cart outside, and walk into the historical record section. He didn't read novels. Instead, he would use the public terminals to browse old, digitized police blotters and crime scene summaries from the 1970s and 80s. It was a deeply ingrained habit, his own private way of staying tethered to the identity that had once defined his entire life. He liked Harold, in a city that was rapidly changing, becoming louder, wealthier, and entirely unrecognizable to the people who grew up here. Harold was a fixed point. The old man possessed a quiet, stoic dignity. He never asked Mike why he sat for hours staring at old murder cases, and he never tried to fill the silence with useless small talk. They had a mutual understanding built on shared isolation. On that particular Tuesday, Mike walked toward the microfilm desks to return a heavy, leather-bound folder of historical city maps he'd been using to trace an old 1974 cold case. As he approached, he saw Harold leaning so close to his computer monitor that his breath was fogging the glass. The old archivist's bushy eyebrows were knitted together, and his fingers were hovering over the keyboard as if he were afraid to touch it. Mike set the folder down on the edge of the desk, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Something wrong, Mr. Jenkins?" Harold jumped slightly, startled out of his concentration. He looked up at Mike, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses nervously. "Oh, hello, Mike. No, it's probably nothing at all. Just an administrative glitch, I suspect. The new digital cloud system. It appears to be misbehaving." Mike leaned his heavy frame against the partition, his analytical eyes narrowing. "What kind of misbehaving?" "These deed scans from the mid-1990s, Harold said, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "Look here. The digital versions on the monitor don't match the physical microfilm records for three specific properties in the Central District. On the film, the original families still hold the titles. But on the digital cloud, ownership shifted to these private shell companies several years ago. The names are changed. The filing dates are moved by just a few weeks. It's small things, but I've checked the physical cross-references 3 times now. The paper records say one thing, the computer says another. Mike leaned in closer, his shoulder brushing against Harold's tweed vest. He stared intensely at the rows of alphanumeric data, the property lines, and the digital notary seals. For a man who had spent 2 decades hunting wolves in human clothing, the sight made his old detective instincts hum with a sudden, electric familiarity. This wasn't a software glitch. This wasn't a server error. The alterations were clean, meticulous, professional. Someone with high-level administrative access had systematically entered the library's secure digitization archive, downloaded the official PDF scans of the historical property deeds, and edited them using sophisticated software before re-uploading them into the permanent locked cloud database. It was a seamless rewrite of public record. Property lines that should have shown unbroken family ownership for half a century now legally pointed toward anonymous corporate entities registered in Delaware and Wyoming. Mike recognized the methodology immediately. He had investigated similar white-collar fraud rings before his retirement. The quiet, insidious theft of generational wealth through bureaucratic sleight of hand. They targeted properties where the original owners were likely too old, too poor, or too disconnected to notice that their ground was being cut out from underneath them. Mike straightened up, his face hardening into an expression Harold had never seen on him before. He cast a quick, cautious glance around the empty library aisle, ensuring none of the younger staff members were within earshot. "Harold," Mike said, his voice dropping into a tight, quiet whisper. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not mention this to anyone else. Not the junior clerks, not the IT staff, not even the head librarian. Do you understand me?" Harold's eyes widened behind his lenses. "Mike, you think this is deliberate?" Mike's jaw tightened. "I don't think it is, Harold. I know it is. You're looking at a crime scene." Over the next 3 weeks, an unlikely and intensely secretive partnership formed between the grieving archivist and the burned-out detective. By day, Harold played the part of the oblivious volunteer. He kept his head down, carefully scanning the ordinary documents assigned to him. But whenever the younger staff members went on their lunch breaks or stepped away to restock the upper shelves, Harold's fingers flew across the keyboard. He created a master spreadsheet hidden deep within an encrypted local directory, a document that would have stunned a professional forensic auditor. He created meticulous columns for the original property owners, the recorded digital owners, the exact date the digital files had been modified in the system logs, and the corresponding vault location of the untampered physical microfilm. While Harold worked the digital shadows of the archives, Mike worked the cold reality of the streets. Using his delivery van as a perfect cover, Mike spent his afternoons visiting the specific addresses Harold flagged on his spreadsheet. He wasn't driving a police cruiser anymore, and he didn't have a gold shield in his pocket. But 23 years of investigative experience don't just vanish when you put on a courier uniform. He approached these properties under the guise of delivering certified mail or checking address logistics for his courier service. On a biting, windy afternoon in early November, Mike pulled up outside a beautifully maintained, modest yellow craftsman home on 23rd Avenue in the heart of Seattle's historic Central District. According to Harold's physical microfilm, this house belonged to Gloria Thompson, an 82-year-old widow whose family had purchased the land in the 1960s. According to the hacked digital database, however, The house had been sold 4 years ago to an entity called Pacific Horizon Properties. Mike stepped out of his van, holding a fake delivery clipboard, and walked up the wooden porch steps. When he knocked, the door opened to reveal an elderly black woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice carrying the warm, rhythmic cadence of the American South. Mike offered a polite, respectful smile, lowering his voice. "Ms. Thompson, my name is Mike. I'm doing some independent verification for the regional courier network regarding property boundaries in this district. I wanted to make sure our delivery logs are accurate. Have you experienced any unusual issues with your mail or property notifications lately?" Gloria Thompson's expression shifted, the warmth draining away, replaced by a deep, exhaustion-lined worry. She hesitated, looking at Mike's uniform before letting out a long, heavy sigh. "Are you with the city?" she asked quietly. "Or are you with those men from the development group?" Mike leaned closer, his tone softening with genuine empathy. "Neither, Ms. Thompson. I used to be a detective with Seattle PD. I'm trying to help some people look into some irregular paperwork at the records office. Has someone been bothering you about this house?" Gloria looked down at her polished wooden floorboards, her throat moving as she swallowed. "Come inside out of the cold, officer," she whispered. The living room was warm, smelling faintly of cinnamon tea and old cedar. The walls were covered in framed black and white photographs, pictures of civil rights marches in downtown Seattle, backyard summer barbecues from the 1970s, men in sharp suits with afros, and children playing on the very porch Mike had just walked across. This wasn't just real estate. This house was a living tapestry of a family's survival in a city that had spent decades trying to push them out. "They told me my property taxes had tripled overnight," Gloria said, her hands trembling as she held a porcelain mug. "They started sending me these official-looking letters. Notices saying I had missed payments from years ago. Payments I know I made. My husband Henry, before he passed, made absolutely sure this house was paid for free and clear. He worked 2 shifts at the Boeing plant for 30 years to give us this ground. But last month, a man in a very expensive suit came to my door. He told me the bank had sold my deed to a corporate group called Pacific Horizon. He told me I was a tenant now. He offered me $20,000 to move out quietly before the formal eviction began." Mike's blood ran cold. He recognized the trap. The perpetrators weren't just altering the library's historical scans for fun. They were using those fraudulent digital records to back up fake tax foreclosures and predatory title claims. When an elderly owner tried to fight the foreclosure in court, the corporate lawyers would point to the altered digital archives at the public library as proof that the property had passed out of the family's hands years ago. It was a perfect ironclad loop of systemic theft. Later that evening, Mike met Harold in the small cafe across the street from the central library. The cafe was dark, illuminated only by the neon sign buzzing in the window, and the coffee tasted like burnt regret. But neither of them cared. If you believe that families like the Thompsons deserve to have their legacies protected against predatory corporate syndicates, make sure to leave a like on this video. Your engagement forces the YouTube algorithm to share this warning with thousands of others, because as Mike and Harold sat in that dim cafe, they realized the theft went all the way to the top of the city's elite. The fraud ran deeper and possessed far more terrifying layers than either the old archivist or the retired cop had anticipated. By the middle of November, Harold's hidden spreadsheet contained 17 separate properties scattered across rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods in the Central District, Beacon Hill, and the old maritime corridors of Ballard. These were the areas where Seattle's tech boom had driven property values into the stratosphere. A single-family home purchased for $40,000 in 1975 was now worth well over $1 million on the open market. The original owners were gold mines of equity, if they could be forced off their land. The new owners, listed on every single altered digital deed, were a collection of separate LLCs registered under confusing alphanumeric names in Delaware and Wyoming, states where corporate transparency laws are notoriously opaque. But Mike hadn't forgotten how to shake down a corporate paper trail. Using an old contact, a retired cynical clerk who still held a grudge at the King County Recorder's Office, Mike spent his nights tracking the corporate registrations, the banking routing numbers, and the tax filing histories. Eventually, all 17 roads led back to a single hyper-modern penthouse office located in the tech-wealthy enclave of South Lake Union. The parent company was called Pacific Horizon Properties. On paper, Pacific Horizon looked like a highly successful, completely legitimate real estate development firm specializing in urban revitalization. They built the sleek glass and steel condominium towers that were rapidly replacing the old brick soul of the city. But in reality, they were a high-tech pirate crew. They targeted elderly owners, immigrant families with severe language barriers, and working-class lineages facing temporary financial distress. Once Harold's digital accomplice altered the library archives, Pacific Horizon's legal team would execute predatory title transfers, forcing the families into sudden, terrifying legal battles they could never afford to win. As the danger grew, the bond between Harold and Mike deepened into something profound. They began staying at the library long after the main doors were locked to the public, sitting in the dim, shadow-strewn staff break room with documents spread across the linoleum table. During those quiet late-night hours, the conversation would inevitably drift away from corporate fraud and into the painful, unspoken realities of their personal lives. Harold talked extensively about Eleanor. He told Mike about how they'd met at a small bookstore on Capitol Hill in 1981, how she used to drag him to the chaotic stalls of Pike Place Market every single Saturday morning, and how she would laugh uncontrollably at his completely terrible, rhythmless dancing in the kitchen while dinner was cooking. Mike listened, without a shred of pity. Pity was a cheap emotion that did nothing for a man's dignity. Instead, Mike offered validation through his own silence, occasionally sharing raw, jagged fragments of his own history. He spoke about his former partner on the force, a young, idealistic kid who had been shot and killed during a botched narcotics raid in 2014. He spoke about how his own marriage had slowly, painfully disintegrated under the pressure of 12-hour shifts, cold case obsessions, and the heavy, unspoken trauma he had carried home every single night. They were two fundamentally broken men, separated by a generation, yet anchored by the exact same brand of isolating grief. "Eleanor always told me I lived too much in the past," Harold said one evening, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the break room microwave. "She said I spent too much time protecting the memories of people who died 100 years ago, while forgetting to live in the present. She always told me I needed more friends who didn't exist entirely between 1850s and 1950s. Mike offered a faint, fleeting smile, taking a slow sip of his lukewarm coffee. "Sounds like she was a smart woman, Harold. Sounds like she kept you honest." "She did," Harold whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "She was the only thing that did." But their quiet investigation was rapidly running out of time. The very next morning, Harold discovered a catastrophic update on his secure spreadsheet. The digital deed for a 4-generation Filipino family home near Columbia City had been altered just 12 hours prior. The new digital scan recorded a full property sale to Pacific Horizon for a mere fraction of its actual market value. The transaction date was listed as 2023, 2 full years after the family's grandfather had passed away. The digital signature on the deed was a crude copy-pasted forgery of a dead man's handwriting. The syndicate wasn't stopping. They were accelerating. They were clearing out the final historic blocks of the old neighborhoods, and they were doing it with absolute impunity because they believed nobody was watching the vaults. The shadow of Pacific Horizon properties now loomed over every row of archival shelves like an oncoming front. The deeper Harold and Mike dug, the more the numbers began to look less like financial figures and more like casualties. This wasn't just a white-collar scam. It was an orchestrated campaign against the memory of the city itself. The turning point of their internal investigation arrived through a break in the clouds, embodied by a young woman named Aisha Thompson. Aisha was Gloria Thompson's granddaughter. She was 28, sharp-witted, and carried herself with the fierce, protective grace of a woman who had fought for every inch of her education. She was a civil rights attorney working out of a small, cramped, nonprofit office in the historic Central District. When Mike initially reached out to her with Harold's hidden spreadsheet, she hadn't believed him. In a city driven by modern tech speculation, paranoid conspiracies about property deeds were a dime a dozen. But when Harold pulled up the raw metadata on the library terminal right in front of her eyes, the skepticism in her face instantly hardened into something dangerous. "They aren't just trying to evict my grandmother," Aisha whispered, her fingers tracing the glowing borders of the digital deed forgery on the monitor. "They are trying to rewrite the legal chain of custody so that it looks like we never existed on 23rd Avenue. If the court sees these library archives, they won't even grant us a hearing. They'll just sign the eviction order." Harold looked at her, his throat tightening with an emotion he hadn't felt since Eleanor's passing. "We won't let them do that, Aisha. This paper is supposed to be a fortress for the truth. It is not a weapon for corporate developers." Aisha joined their secret circle, bringing a crucial piece of the puzzle that Mike's street contacts couldn't provide: legal context. She knew exactly which state statutes Pacific Horizon was exploiting, and she knew how to file a federal injunction. But to do it, they needed the definitive, uncompressed system logs, the definitive proof of who inside the library had authorized the digital file modifications. And that was when Harold's world truly began to fracture. It was a damp, suffocating Friday afternoon when Harold decided to audit the internal network security logs. He waited until the rest of the staff had left for a weekend seminar, leaving him entirely alone in the subterranean quiet of the records room. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic click of his mouse. He traced the administrative user tokens that had bypassed the library's firewall to alter the Thompson family deed. The login credential didn't belong to a mysterious hacker outside the city. It belonged to user token 049. Harold sat back in his worn leather chair, his face losing all of its color. 049 belonged to Margaret. Margaret, the head of special collections, the woman who had given Harold his volunteer position after Eleanor died, the woman who had stood at Eleanor's funeral, holding Harold's hand and weeping tears that he now realized were completely hollow. The institutional betrayal felt like a physical blow to his chest. The syndicate hadn't broken into his sanctuary. His sanctuary had opened its gates from the inside out. Margaret was feeding the digital access keys directly to Victor Lang's lawyers in South Lake Union, acting as the bureaucratic executioner for 17 helpless families. If you believe that institutional corruption should always be exposed, and that ordinary people can break a corrupt system when they stand together, make sure to subscribe to Voice of Uncle Adam. We don't let these narratives fade into the dark. Because as the realization of Margaret's betrayal settled into Harold's bones, he knew they were running out of time. He called Mike immediately from a payphone outside the building, his voice a trembling, ragged whisper. "Mike, it's Margaret. She's the one doing it. She knows I'm auditing the logs. She looked at me before she left today. She looked right at my satchel." Mike's gravelly voice cut through the static of the line like a knife. "Listen to me, Harold. Pack up every single printout you have. Do not leave them on the library servers. Put them in your leather bag and stay under the security cameras until I get there. The storm is moving in and things are about to get incredibly dangerous." Harold hung up the receiver, his hands shaking as he walked back into the dimming library. The sky outside was rapidly turning the color of charcoal, and the first heavy drops of a historic Pacific Northwest deluge were beginning to strike the glass panes above. The air inside the archives felt thick, charged with an invisible pressure. The trap was springing, and Harold was holding the only ledger that could stop it. The stormy Thursday that changed everything arrived with a savage, unrelenting fury. By late afternoon, the Pacific Northwest sky had turned an ominous, bruised shade of purple-black. A historic cold front had collided with an atmospheric river, unleashing a torrential deluge that turned Seattle's steep, hilly streets into rushing, concrete rivers. The wind howled through the skyscrapers of the financial district, rattling the massive plate glass windows of the central library like an angry creditor demanding entry. Inside the historical records section, the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered occasionally, casting long, unstable shadows across the endless rows of iron bookstacks. Harold had stayed long after his official volunteer shift ended. The library closed to the public at 7, but he had managed to slip past the security desk, hiding away in a small, unlit archival scanning room on the third floor. His eyes were bloodshot, strained from staring at the harsh glare of the monitor for 9 hours straight. His fingers were stiff with cold, but he refused to stop typing. He was downloading the raw, uncompressed metadata from the altered digital files, the hidden digital fingerprints that contained the precise IP addresses and administrative login codes used to execute the forgeries. At exactly 7:45 p.m., the heavy, reinforced steel staff door at the rear of the archive clicked open. Harold froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He held his breath, listening intensely. Through the darkness of the stacks, he heard the heavy, rhythmic slosh of wet rubber soles and the distinctive, rustling sound of a dripping courier jacket. "Harold?" A low, familiar voice growled through the gloom. Harold let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping in relief. It was Mike. "Over here, Mike," Harold called out quietly, stepping out of the scanning room. Mike walked into the dim light, shaking a sheet of freezing rainwater from his dark wool cap. His face was set in a hard, grim expression that instantly made Harold's stomach twist with anxiety. "You shouldn't be here right now, old man. The building is totally dead, and you're a sitting duck. We're leaving. Right now." "Just 5 more minutes, Mike," Harold pleaded, pointing back toward the glowing terminal. "I found the digital signatures, the IP addresses used to modify the deeds. They didn't come from an outside hacker. They came from a terminal located directly inside this building. It's an inside job. Someone on the senior staff has been feeding the system access codes to Pacific Horizon." Mike didn't look surprised. He grabbed Harold's heavy leather satchel, the one Eleanor had gifted him for their 30th wedding anniversary, and began stuffing the printed forensic logs into it. "We'll deal with the insider tomorrow with the feds. Right now, my old detective partner calls me from the West Precinct. He says a private security firm connected to Pacific Horizon just flagged my license plate. They know we've been digging, Harold. They know we're onto the Central District files. My truck is idling in the alley. Get your coat." Harold hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at the history preserved around him before nodding slowly. Pride and academic obsession have their limits when your knees ache. The air smells of impending violence, and the darkness feels heavier than usual. The drive through the rain-slicked, pitch-black streets of Seattle was a nightmare of blinding headlights and hydroplaning tires. Mike's old Ford Transit van smelled heavily of stale black coffee, cardboard boxes, and wet wool. The windshield wipers fought a violent, losing battle against the sheet of water slamming into the glass. Harold sat rigidly in the passenger seat, his arms wrapped tightly around the leather satchel in his lap as if it were a shield. "If it's an inside job," Harold said, his voice barely audible over the roaring storm outside, "it can only be one of three people. Lydia Chen, our digitization coordinator. She has administrator privileges. Or Robert Klein, the part-time IT tech. Or Margaret, the head of special collections. She has final approval on every single cloud upload." Mike's hands tightened on the worn steering wheel until his knuckles turned a stark, bony white. "My money is on the coordinator. She's the one who stays until midnight every Tuesday. It's the perfect time to rewrite history when nobody's looking over your shoulder." They turned onto Harold's quiet, tree-lined street in the Ballard neighborhood. The historic craftsman homes stood like dark, silent sentinels under the flickering yellow glow of the old streetlights. Harold's house waited at the end of the block, its front porch light glowing with a warm, amber hue. The old automatic light timer that Eleanor had set up years ago still worked with absolute, flawless precision. Mike pulled the van up to the curb, but he didn't turn off the engine. He sat perfectly still, his eyes darting to the rearview mirrors, scanning the dark perimeter of the property. "I don't like it," Mike muttered, his hand instinctively dropping toward the empty space beneath his driver's seat where his service weapon used to rest. "The side gate is unlatched. You always keep that gate locked, don't you, Harold?" Harold blinked, looking through the passenger window. "Yes. Always. Eleanor was terrified of raccoons getting into the garbage bins." "Stay in the van," Mike commanded, his voice cold, hard, and utterly unyielding. "Mike, wait!" But Mike was already out the door, stepping straight into the freezing, torrential downpour. He insisted on walking Harold to the door, checking the shadows first. That single, instinctual decision was the only reason Harold Jenkins survived the night. As Mike escorted Harold up the slick wooden porch steps, a sudden violent movement erupted from the pitch-black shadows near the side of the house. A tall, lean figure dressed entirely in dark hooded tactical gear lunged forward from the darkness. In the flickering yellow streetlight, something metallic and heavy flashed through the falling rain. A solid steel crowbar, aimed directly at the back of Harold's head. Mike's 23 years of police muscle memory didn't hesitate. Before the weapon could connect, Mike threw his entire heavy frame forward, shoving Harold violently to the wooden porch floor. The crowbar missed Harold's skull by a mere fraction of an inch, striking the wooden railing with a loud, splintering crack. The struggle that followed was brief, chaotic, and brutal. The attacker was young, fast, and fueled by adrenaline, but Mike possessed the heavy, unmovable weight of a man who had survived a lifetime of alleyway violence. He took a heavy, glancing blow to his left ribs, a strike that reopened the phantom pain in his damaged lung. But he didn't back down. With a low, animalistic snarl, Mike grabbed the attacker by the front of his wet jacket, using his massive leverage to slam the man violently backward against the wet cedar siding of the house. The man dropped the steel crowbar, the weapon clattering loudly down the steps, and attempted to turn and flee toward the dark alleyway. But Mike reached out with a massive, calloused hand, catching the man by his hood, and drove him face first down into the mud of the front lawn, pinning him beneath his full weight. "Stay down!" Mike roared into the wind, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fury. "Do not move a muscle!" Up on the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, Harold scrambled to his feet. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his phone, but he forced his fingers to dial 911. Within 10 minutes, the quiet Ballard Street was washed in a brilliant, flashing sea of red and blue police lights. The sirens cut through the howling wind of the storm, bringing a sudden, definitive end to the silence that had haunted Harold's life for 14 months. The real breaking point of the Pacific Horizon Syndicate did not occur on the rain-slicked lawns of Ballard. It occurred the next morning under the harsh, humming, fluorescent lights of an interrogation room at the West Precinct downtown. The attacker caught at Harold's house had carried no identification, no wallet, and no driver's license. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had been carrying a secure, encrypted smartphone that he failed to lock before Mike pinned him into the mud. Within hours, digital forensic detectives with the Seattle Police Department had pulled dozens of text messages, wire transfer receipts, and secure location logs from the device. The digital trail led directly to a high-end private security firm frequently retained to do risk management for Pacific Horizon properties. But the most damning piece of evidence was a series of text messages sent from a burner phone just 30 minutes before the attack. The text read, "The archivist has the forensic cloud logs in his leather bag. Make sure the old man doesn't make it home tonight. Erase the files." The sender's phone number was tied to a digital SIM card registered under a fake name. But the location data proved the text had been sent from a computer terminal inside the library's administrative office. By 10 a.m., Lydia Chen was sitting across from Mike and a senior detective in the small, sterile interrogation room. Lydia looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly terrified, stripped of her usual composed professional efficiency. She was wrapped in a cheap gray police blanket, her fingers trembling so violently she couldn't even lift the paper cup of water they had placed in front of her. Mike had used every single remaining favor, every ounce of leverage he held from his 23 years on the force to be allowed inside that room. He stood silently in the corner, his heavy arms crossed over his chest, his analytical eyes fixed on the young woman like a hawk watching a field mouse. Harold stood just outside the room, watching through the one-way mirrored glass, his leather satchel resting securely at his feet. I never wanted anyone to get hurt," Lydia whispered, her voice a hollow, cracking sob that barely carried across the metal table. "They told me it was just paperwork. They told me the families had already been compensated, that it was just a legal technicality to speed up the urban renewal projects. They said the city needed these new tech corridors." The lead detective leaned forward, his tone cold and unyielding. "You altered 17 official property deeds, Lydia. You used your administrator access to change historical public records so a billionaire developer could steal land from elderly widows and low-income families. Who paid you?" Lydia buried her face in her trembling hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she broke down completely. "Victor Lang," she sobbed, "the executive director of Pacific Horizon. He approached me 2 years ago at a real estate seminar. He offered me a private offshore account in the Caymans. They paid me $10,000 for every deed scan I modified. And when I tried to stop last month because the guilt was making me sick, Lang sent men to my apartment. They showed me photographs of my parents. They told me if I didn't finish the Central District blocks, my family would pay the price. The system was so easy to manipulate once I gave them the back-end administrative bypass codes." She didn't stop there. Once the dam broke, the entire conspiracy poured out of her. She detailed how Robert Klein, The part-time IT support technician had been paid to write custom software scripts that wiped the internal system access logs so Harold would never see who logged in. More horrifyingly, she revealed that Margaret, the esteemed head of special collections and Harold's direct supervisor, had been fully aware of the fraud for over a year. Margaret had looked the other way, intentionally signing off on the fraudulent digital cloud transfers in exchange for a massive, multi-million-dollar cut of the equity when the properties were flipped to wealthy tech executives. The door to the interrogation room clicked open, and Harold walked inside. The lead detective tried to wave him off, but Mike raised a single hand, signaling him to let the old man speak. Harold walked slowly over to the metal table, looking down at Lydia. There was no hatred in his eyes. There was no desire for vengeance. There was only a deep, profound, and righteous sorrow. "You didn't just alter paperwork, Lydia," Harold said, his voice trembling with a quiet, devastating fury that silenced the entire room. "You changed history. You looked at the records of people who spent their entire lives bleeding into this city, people who survived segregation, poverty, and redlining to give their children a piece of the American dream. And you used a keyboard to erase their existence. You stole their lives." Lydia couldn't look him in the eye. She collapsed forward onto the cold metal table, weeping uncontrollably as the detectives moved in to formally record her confession. The fallout across King County was a massive, unprecedented legal earthquake. Within 48 hours, federal agents with the FBI and the IRS executed simultaneous raid warrants on Pacific Horizon's penthouse offices in South Lake Union. Victor Lang was arrested as he tried to board a private jet at Boeing Field, hit with a mountain of federal charges including wire fraud, grand theft, conspiracy, and money laundering. The quiet fortress of the library archives had brought a billion-dollar empire crashing to the ground. The weeks that followed the arrests were a chaotic, exhausting blur of formal depositions, intense media coverage, and long nights spent reconstructing the truth. To his absolute horror, Harold found himself transformed into an unlikely local hero. The local news stations ran front-page stories with headlines like "Retired Library Archivist Uncovers Multi-Million-Dollar Real Estate Syndicate." He absolutely hated the public attention. He was a man designed for the shadows of the stacks, not the bright glare of television cameras. But he accepted the interviews for one specific reason. It kept the pressure on the courts to restore the stolen land. A massive team of pro bono civil rights lawyers descended upon the city, forming complex class action lawsuits representing the 17 victimized families. Because Harold's hidden spreadsheet provided an unassailable, mathematically perfect chain of custody back to the original physical microfilm, the fraudulent corporate titles were obliterated in court. By the time the early blossoms of spring began to appear on the cherry trees outside the library, Gloria Thompson and her granddaughter Aisha stood on the steps of the courthouse, holding the official, legally restored deed to their yellow craftsman home on 23rd Avenue. On a pleasant, crisp evening in late December, as the festive Christmas lights twinkled cheerfully along the brick storefronts of Ballard Avenue, Harold invited Mike inside his house for the very first time. The living room still carried Eleanor's unmistakable, timeless touch. The hand-crocheted wool blanket still rested neatly over the back of the sofa. The shelves were still lined with her favorite vintage mystery novels. Her favorite reading lamp sat exactly where she had left it 14 months ago. But the heavy, suffocating silence that had once filled the space had finally begun to lift. Harold walked over to the wooden cabinet and poured 2 generous glasses of premium bourbon, handing one to the retired detective. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Mike," Harold said softly, walking over to stand by the fireplace. "The library board asked me to come back out of volunteer retirement. They want me to consult on a full overhaul of their digital security protocol. But I told them I would only do it on one condition. Mike took a slow sip of his bourbon, his eyes reflecting the warm glow of the fire. What's the condition, old man? I want to establish a permanent historical training program, Harold said, a genuine spark of passion returning to his voice for the first time in over a year. I want to teach the younger generation of clerks how to really read the records, not just how to type data into a computer, but how to protect the physical truth of the past, how to act as a fortress for the people who built this city. Mike nodded slowly, a deep sense of respect settling over his rugged features. Sounds like a solid plan, Harold. And as for me, I talked to my old captain today. I'm officially pulling the paperwork to get my private investigator license active again. Part-time. Nothing crazy, just I think there are a lot more families out there who need someone to look into the paperwork they don't understand. They clinked their glasses together, the clear, sharp sound echoing pleasantly through the warm living room. Outside, the harsh winter rain had finally eased, giving way to a clear, star-studded sky. Seattle's lights shimmered beautifully on the wet concrete streets below like millions of scattered diamonds. Deep within the climate-controlled vaults of the Central Library, the physical deeds of the city rested safely in their steel drawers, bearing silent, unyielding witness to lives that had refused to be erased by corporate greed. Harold turned around and looked at the framed photograph of Eleanor sitting on the mantelpiece. Her smile was bright, vibrant, and completely timeless. For the first time, in 14 long months, the old Craftsman house didn't feel quite so empty. Thank you so much for watching Voice of Uncle Adam. If this story of resistance, deep justice, and friendship across generations moved you, please share it with someone who believes that the past is always worth fighting for. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a like to support our independent narrative channel. Until our next journey through history, stay vigilant and keep the memories alive.